So a few years ago, I was playing indoor soccer with some colleagues. I got a kick in my leg. It was right here. It was just behind the shin pad, so it really hurt, but it was okay. I went back to the office, it started to swell up a bit. So I got some ice, got on the train, I went home, and I got to my stop, and I could not walk. And I had to call my wife, like, I'm sitting in the gutter, can you come and get me? And she did, because she's lovely. But a couple of days later, my lower leg had swollen up ludicrously all the way down to my toes, and I was like exactly 1/4 of Popeye. And that's the first stat. So I went to the doctor, and she had a look, and she made this noise, which is not encouraging. And she kind of poked and prodded there for a little bit, and she had to think for a minute, and then she said, just sit down with me. And we sat down. So we're sitting down, and she's looking at her computer, and she just starts typing in. And she's just putting my symptoms into Google. And not even like fancy doctor research portal, just regular old, you put your symptoms in and you find out you're going to die in 5 minutes kind of Google. It was very disturbing. And to be clear, obviously I recovered. My leg is back to its normal non-Popeye size. But it did make me feel uncomfortable for a minute. I wasn't quite sure why, and I had to think about this. And I think I had this mental model of doctors as knowing everything. It's kind of a childlike idea of what a doctor is. And of course, that's not true, right? The doctors have access to incredible amounts of information that are collected elsewhere. And I should know this because in my job in customer service, it's exactly the same. I get these customers all the time. They email in, and I look at that and I'm like, no idea. But I know where to go, I know which documents to look at, I know how to understand of all those possible answers, which is the one that's relevant to this person in this context, and how can I communicate that to them. Exactly what a doctor is doing, except you usually don't have to see it. But it made me think about the relationship between the people who put all those documents together and build those incredible knowledge bases, and then the people who use them to deliver service to their customers ultimately. And so that's what I want to talk about today is that connection. How do we get most value, specifically in the form of software knowledge bases, how do we get the most value out of the relationship between the support people and the technical writers to kind of just power up the whole thing and deliver ultimately better customer service? So that's the plan. We're going to do it in 3 parts. We're going to diagnose the problem a little bit and just talk about software knowledge bases. We're going to give some case histories here from 3 companies, Campaign Monitor, Survey Gizmo, and You Need a Budget. And then we're going to extract out of that a little bit of a treatment option, just some ideas, hopefully some really practical things that you can use to make an improvement in how your processes work wherever you are. So let's start with the diagnosis. I don't know about you, but certainly in my job, I use a million different knowledge bases because of all the different SaaS products we use just as part of my job. Some of them are great, a lot of them are not great, and some of them are just kind of non-existent. And I don't think, in almost all cases, I don't think it's because like the people writing them aren't good writers or good communicators or aren't really trying. I think it's almost always a factor of the environment that they're in and the kind of business that they've built, the way that it works, that makes it really hard. But there are a few things that make creating software knowledge bases specifically a little bit tricky. So I think in a lot of cases it's because a support person gets brought in really early. Certainly for me at Campaign Monitor in my last job, I was the 4th person there. So the 2 founders, and then 1 developer, and then me. And that's just because no matter how obsessed with customer service a founder might be, they still have to actually, build the product and run the business. They just run out of time pretty quickly. So the support person's usually pretty early, not always. But a technical writer often doesn't get brought in for quite a bit longer. That's because you can kind of get away with it for a while. You can have your founders writing documents still. You can have your developers writing documents, depending on the developer. You can have support people quite often writing a lot of documentation. And that can work for a while. And if it's not fantastic, it's sort of okay because you've got the support team there as a backstop to catch everyone who falls through. A backstop is a sports reference, and that's the only sports reference you're going to get. So enjoy that. But by the time you do get that technical writer in, it's usually not because everything is going super well with the knowledge base and there's no problems. It's usually not the most magnificent condition. It's often more like this, in the museum of the previously true-ish. It's just a whole bunch of stuff that at one time was probably accurate and now is somewhat less than accurate. And so it's starting from a tough position, I think it's good to recognise this. Certainly as support staff, I think we realise how hard the job is to maintain that. And software documentation in particular, and SaaS companies, which is my experience, pretty hard, and I blame mostly David Bowie. Because of all the changes. You know, you can come into work with a perfect knowledge base and everything is up to date, and then at 11 o'clock somebody pushes something, and now 400 different screenshots are out of date because the button's changed and that label doesn't make sense anymore, and you just create an enormous amount of work just like that. And so it's pretty complicated. It's a pretty complicated thing to maintain at the best of times. And particularly with agile development processes, I think we can all agree, you know, delivering value to customers more quickly, fantastic, all for that. But agile engineering is not the same thing as agile documentation or support. And so it's not always completely coordinated between those two groups. And it can work, but often it's a bit more like you're chasing the cheese down the hill, that product is just rolling away from you, and you're just trying to keep up to it. And this is why it's difficult. It's a difficult job. So it's a real sport. I was wrong. There was 2 sports references. Hey. So I think about this as kind of 2 ends of a spectrum here. Like, what is this relationship between the support teams and the writing teams? And it kind of goes from one end to the other. You've got your unattainable utopia and your entropy and chaos. And I think it helps us to understand what those 2 extremes look like, and we can figure out where in between are we and where do we want to get to. So let's start here in utopia, or The Good Place, which, good show, you should watch that. In The Good Place, this is what it's like. You've got the product in the middle. They're radiating out perfect information out to the writers and out to the support team. And then around in this lovely continuous hug of a circle, they have the writers producing all the great documentation and saying this is the way it's meant to be and this is why it is the way it is, and we're updating it, we're adding new kinds of methods. And they're feeding that to support. And support is taking that, delivering great service to the customers, and then getting feedback and passing it back into the writers about, hey, this bit's still a bit confusing. People are getting stuck here. The competitors actually talk about this in a different way, and so that's a bit confusing to our customers. And all of that stuff goes around, and it's beautiful. It's the dream. Okay, so this is one end, right? This is the good end of the spectrum. But of course, there is another end. It's the bad place. In the bad place, you've still got all the same elements, pretty much. You've got support, you've got product, you've got technical writers. It's just a bit all over the place. The support team is doing their best. They're using some of those documents. Maybe some of the documents they've kind of abandoned because they're not great anymore, and they're just hoarding their own individual documents. The technical writers, you know, they're still documenting, but they're a little bit more like, they're not really orbiting the product anymore. They're sort of Halley's cometing the product. Just dump it on a feature. We'll come back to that feature in another 70 years. And the customers in this scenario, the poor old customers are like detached from reality and floating about by themselves, flailing along, sort of like Sandra Bullock in that movie. Not that movie. That's the nightmare scenario. You know, everything's falling apart, nobody trusts anybody, there's no communication anymore, everyone sort of just gives up on the whole thing. You're probably not at either of those ends. Wherever you are, if you're working on software support, you're probably not one end or the other. You're probably somewhere in the middle. You might feel like you're closer to one of those. I don't think we can get to utopia. Obviously, it's unattainable utopia, it says it in the name. I think we just want to move a little bit up. That's all we can really try and do. So let's talk about that. I wanted to talk about 3 companies, and we'll start with Campaign Monitor because that's where I spent nearly a decade, which is about 1,000 years in normal time. And I wrote a bazillion documents for Campaign Monitor. It's an email marketing piece of software. It started up in Sydney. So I wrote a ton there. But if you go to the knowledge base now and look it up, you'll find exactly 0 of my documents left. They've all been replaced by these 2 people, Carly and Craig, who do a much better job at it. They're the 2 technical writers for Campaign Monitor. And so it's a big company, you know, hundreds of people working on the product. There's lots of product teams. There's lots of support people. There's just 2 technical writers. And this is an application, a SaaS application that's been around almost 15 years. So it's quite complex at this point. It's a big job. And so I talked to Carly about how do you kind of maintain all of that history, all of that past stuff, keep it up to date. What's the big challenges? What are you doing about it? So for Carly, she kind of sees it as like, I've got 3 customers. I've got the actual customers. I've got the support team, and internally the product teams. Like, these are all different customers that I have. And just the reality of it is the urgency of new features always takes priority over coming back to fix other things that are already there. Even though everyone can agree, it's really important to go back and maintain those things. And so what she's tried to do is try and get more of that stuff done by pulling more from the support team and trying to get them to help speed up the process, catch some of those things, and keep a little bit up to date. So this is what she's ended up doing. They now use user voice. So previously, if something was broken, it might go in Slack, it might go in this weird wiki article that hasn't really been updated, but you can still find in the search. It might go person to person in the hallway. So she's just pulled that all together into user voice. It's an internal only forum. So the customer service person, if they see an article they think needs fixing, they can just grab the title, they come in here, they paste it in. One of 2 things happens. Either it's already in there and it just pops up and they just hit vote, like, yes, I also think this needs to be fixed. And that is a really quick way of just prioritization of, like, if we've got some time, what should we fix? That bubbles that stuff to the top. If it's new, you get a little form, you fill it in, you say, this is what I think needs to be done, and they can have a little conversation about that. So keeping it all in one place, making it as quick as possible for support. The other thing Carly mentioned when she was talking about this, she said, like, to make this work, I really needed Mick Jagger. You've got to tell people what you want, right? You've got to ask for it specifically what you need, because if you don't, you get, and as support people, we should know this. We always get these questions like, it's broken, what are you doing? Like, I can't do much with that, but then we still, in support, send in to technical writers, this document's broken, what are you doing? You got to tell them, that doesn't help me. I need to know what's actually broken, what's the customer's context, what are they trying to get done when they're on that page? So you've got to ask for that stuff. And so Carly and Craig, they do that by a little bit of training, a little bit of sitting down with support and saying, this is what a good request looks like, and this is what your request looks like, and can you see the differences there? Probably. I bet they don't do it in a patronising way like I just did. And then they close the loop. They close the loop with this email newsletter. So it goes every month to the support teams and the customer-facing teams. It does 2 things. One, it calls out the people who are contributing and says, hey, Kimberly, you asked for this. You made this request. We took that. We did it. Here it is. Thank you so much for contributing, just to encourage people to keep doing it. And it tells the rest of the team, if you're talking to customers about any of these topics, you can send them to these things, confidently now because it's been updated. We've reviewed it. We can trust that it's accurate. So it builds that trust and it keeps that loop going around. And Carly's last point that she wanted to make clear was actually a Farnsey one. She said, we have this role in the company, and the way Campaign Monitor works, the support people often don't get included in the product meetings until quite late. They get brought in at the end, but Carly and Craig are in there earlier, and they're in there more often, and so they're able to kind of bring in a bit of support perspective and try and advocate for them earlier in the process. So that's what I learned from Campaign Monitor. Here's YNAB. YNAB is you need a budget, which is quite aggressively sounding for personal financial budgeting software. But as you can imagine, when you're dealing with people's money, people have lots of feelings and people have lots of questions about money. So there's a big, big knowledge base behind this thing. And I was talking to Michelle there on the support team, and she said, she told me something interesting. They have 40, actually closer to 50, but that doesn't work for the tennis thing. I'm like, there's another sports reference. That was poor planning on my part. They have 40 technical writers and other way around. They have 40 support people, 0 technical writers, so none at all. It's a really big knowledge base. They've got 40 different people, maybe close to 50 different people writing the knowledge base, which seems incredible to me. And I asked her, how do you make that work? And what are you trying to do with having so many different writers? What's the point? And so she said, here's the thing. We used to have people just kind of doing it as they could and squeezing it into gaps. And it was just a little chaotic. Like nobody knew what was going on or who was responsible for anything. So what they did was, first they pulled every piece of content, not the content itself, but like an index to that content, all into one place. So if it's on the mobile application documentation, whether it's the support team's internal documentation, whether it's the website facing, customer facing docs, all of it comes in here as linked in from the one page. Every little topic that you can see there is assigned to a particular group, like 3 or 4 support people, and that thing scrolls and scrolls. But then if there is anything that needs to be changed, updated, deleted, or added to that topic, then it's very clear whose job that is, because there's only 3 people and there's a leader of that team, and everyone can come into one place and put the request in, and it's really, really clear then, is that thing happening, who's responsible for it, where's it up to, what stage is it at? So they pulled it all in there, and they had two big goals that they were trying to achieve with this system. One was to just make it obvious that stuff is happening. They used to have a big spreadsheet. People kind of stopped using it because it just looked like the spreadsheet was just endless. It wasn't clear if anything was ever removed from it or updated, or if it's on there, does that mean someone's going to do it, or that someone should do it but no one's actually going to do it? It was really unclear. So they wanted to make it very, very obvious and transparent where stuff's up to and whose job it is to do it. So that's one big thing. And the second was to extract knowledge from the support people's heads. If you've been around in a support team, especially in the software world, there's certain types of questions you get from customers where if you were there when the product changed from doing it this way to doing it this other way, you understand that question because you're like, oh, you're thinking of it in the old way and now it works this way, but I can get you from here over to here because I was there too. But of course, if you're a support person who came in after that, you have no idea what they're talking about, and that makes no sense. And so extracting that from the support people and putting it into somewhere where everyone can see it, that was a big goal. And so that's why they have everybody contributing, because it's an easy way to try and capture all of that stuff and make it accessible. My third company that I spoke to, Survey Gizmo. If you're like me, the first time you see that name, you're like, I know what that is. It's this. Turns out it's not. Turns out it's actually just boring old survey software, but that's fine because they do things in an interesting way. I talked to David there, he was on the support team and now he's a technical writer, and he talked to me about this just-in-time documentation. Now we already heard a little bit about this yesterday, this kind of approach to rapid iteration and having the knowledge base be like the source of truth. I pulled this quote out because what they were trying to say is basically, we used to try and get ahead of all that customer questions and predict what was going to be asked and answer those things. And then we were finding, turns out we're not real good at that. And we were having to revisit a lot of it anyway and rewrite it afterwards. And so they moved to this system of only writing documentation in response to real questions. And so to make that work, essentially what happens is the support team get the question in, very much like David was describing yesterday. They look at that question. Maybe there's already a document for it. Great. If not, you write up the answer yourself in support. But when you get to the bottom of that conversation, there's a little checkbox there. And that is saying, this thing that you just wrote, is this just for this customer? Like real specific to this customer in that context? Or is it something that could be generalized out to lots of customers? And if it can, you check the box. Off it goes to the technical writers. It appears in this spreadsheet here, and they work their way through very quickly. It only works if you do this quickly, right? That they take that answer, they turn it into a publishable document, they publish it, they send it immediately back to the support person, who then can say, here's the answer to your question, here's the knowledge base article in which that appears, and off it goes. And so you're really shortening the loop and getting stuff through really, really quickly. But to make that work, obviously, everybody needs to be on board, and you need support to do a good job of answering in a way that is kind of generalizable. So I talked to David about how you do that. He really had 2 things. One is you need to understand how support works. It's really hard to ask something of a support team if you don't understand the context in which they're working. And he said, maybe you can sit in to some support meetings and just listen to the pressures that they're under. What are they getting measured against? And how does that map against what you need them to do? Because if there's a big disconnect there, you're going to have a hard time getting them to spend any time on it. Maybe you can do a support shift and really feel the pain a little bit of there's always another conversation waiting. So it's hard to spend a little bit of extra time when you know that someone else is getting a worse experience for it. So it's a really tricky environment, but the more you know about it, the better you'll be able to figure out, all right, how can we work together? And he also said, get yourself an apprentice. If you're a technical writer, this is what happened to David. He was in support, and everyone was having a turn at doing a bit of writing, but then the technical writer noticed, oh, this guy's actually really good at this, and he seems more interested in it, and so she kind of trained him up and eventually pulled him out of support to become the second technical writer. Maybe you don't go that far, maybe you just find someone in the team who is on board with documentation and who will be your secret ally in the support team, who can advocate for, hey, let's spend a bit of time on documentation while we have this little quiet window here. So those are the three that I talked to. And I talked to a bunch of other people too, but I wanted to kind of extrapolate from that just a few practical tips, maybe some stuff that you can try. We want to develop this. We want a mutualistic symbiosis, which is, every side benefits from the relationship, like the bees and the flowers. And I guess in this case, the flowers would be the knowledge base and the pollen would be the articles, and the bees are the support people, and the customers get, I don't know, actually. You figure out how the metaphor works. I'm just going to move on to this. Okay, first thing, everyone I talk to, if you want something from support, you have to make it really easy because their jobs are like real bit. They don't have big blocks of time to work, so you've got to find ways like, how can I make this really fast for them to contribute in a useful way? So think about the little checkbox that Survey Gizmo had. Interesting part of that story is that they had that checkbox, it was working really well. They changed help desks, they couldn't implement the checkbox in the same way, and so they had to do like a little pop-up form, and that just really cut into the number of reports they actually got through, just because there's a little bit of extra work and everyone's got something else to do. So reduce friction in any way that you can. That might mean, can you just give them a tag, like you just put this needs documentation tag on the thing and I'll search for that later, and that will be enough. Or maybe you can look at the reporting they're already doing and say, which of these saved replies are you using heaps? Maybe that's an indicator that there's a problem somewhere further upstream that we can address. Reduce friction however you can. Find someone to be your champion in support. So like David was saying, get into the support team, identify the people who are going to be your allies in there. Some people in support probably not going to care that much about the documentation. Some of them really love it and some of them are really excited to help you do it. And if you find those people, maybe bring them into your meetings, get them excited about, hey, we could solve a whole bunch of support questions here if we address this in the documentation, and then send them back into support and just get them to advocate for spending some more time on it. Be a good wingman to your support team. Get in there and we've heard it a bunch in the last 2 days. We've heard a lot of support is your natural ally. You're trying to do the same thing. So if you can find ways to include support into what you need, you're much more likely to be able to get them to spend a bit of their kind of very limited time on helping you out too. Similarly, try and build a bit of that trust. Think about how Campaign Monitor was like closing that loop and sending the communication about, hey, you put some time in here, but it's paying off because here's what you get for it. Here's what you get for it. You need a budget with their full transparency of everything. This is where everything is up to. You can always look and see that stuff is happening, things are being done, and it's worth spending your time. And ask for what you want. So the more specific you can be about what you need, the better results you'll get. I used to get, as a support leader, products teams coming to me and technical writers too, just saying, what can you tell me about the customers and billing? What do they think about that? And that's just a hard question to answer. I can give you a very vague answer, but if you want something really specific, like what language do people use when they're talking about annual plans and they're getting confused? That's something that I can really answer and I can get my team to focus on. And we can find specific information if we know that that's what you need. And ultimately, just be pragmatic about it. You've got a busy job, support's got a busy job. They don't have blocks of time. You're probably not going to get them to do half a day of documentation. You probably got to think of what can we get done in these little gaps that they have, or this 2-hour block that they have on a Friday where it's pretty quiet. What could we get done there? Because this is where we want to get to, of course. This is the good place, remember? And when I think about what does it look like to have a really effective relationship between technical writers and support, I think about, and this is the second reference to this today, Voltron. I think about Voltron, actually, and depending on your age, possibly Captain Planet. So, I don't know if you're like me, but when I watched this as a kid, or either of these shows, Always the first 20 minutes when they just piss-farting around as individuals, always failing. Like, why? Just, you know that you're eventually going to be Voltron. Just be Voltron. All you're wasting your time for every time. So let's just be Voltron together. So here's the quick summary for you. If there's less friction, you'll get more participation. If you identify and you uplift your support champions, they're going to do for you what you need. You can build that trust. You can ask for what you want. You can be really pragmatic about it. And that's how we are going to get it all done. And I sort of regret ending the entire thing with this, but it's not about the docs. I didn't realise I was going to be the last speaker when I put that slide in there. But what I mean is, in support, the documents are like manna from heaven for us. They solve so many problems. There's nothing better than a knowledge base we can really trust and I can send my customer to knowing that they're going to get a good experience there. It's so good. But the point of the docs is not to have really good docs. The point of the documentation is this customer is trying to get something done. They're using our software because they think it's going to help them get there. Maybe they could use other software, whatever it is. They're trying to get a goal that is not to do with the software at all. And if we can just help them get that done, that's success. And that is exactly the same job that support is trying to do. We are doing exactly the same things. We're all about help the customer get where the customer needs to get to. And let's just find ways that we can do that together. Thank you.